Have you ever felt like trying to learn some of these really complex STEM topics is a bit like you get that big box of furniture and you're trying to put it together and the instructions are written in ancient Greek or something.
Right.
It's like you just want some guidance, right? You're desperate for a helping hand that you don't want to feel overwhelmed either.
Yeah.
And that's where this whole idea of computer-based scaffolding comes in. It's like having digital tools to help you along the way.
Yeah. Imagine it as temporary support structures, like scaffolding on a building. It's there to help you during the construction process, and once you've mastered the skill or concept, it can be removed. So, think of it as training wheels for your brain, if you
Yeah.
will. These are digital tools that can really make complex learning more manageable.
So we're talking about computer-based scaffolding, or CBS for short. And the research you shared with me really delves into how effective this is, especially in a learning style called problem-centered instruction, or PCI. And I think PCI maybe needs a little explanation, right? For those who aren't familiar with the pedagogical term, what's the best way to think about PCI?
Well, I think the best way to think about problem-centered instruction is that it's learning by doing. So you're actively engaged in solving real-world problems rather than just passively absorbing information. And PCI encompasses several different forms of learning. As you can see in Figure 1, you've got problem-based learning, where you're presented with a problem right off the bat and you have to figure out how to solve it. There's also inquiry-based learning, where you're kind of like a detective asking questions and investigating to uncover the answers. And then there's case-based learning, where you might analyze a real-life situation, like a business scenario or a medical case. So all of these different approaches fall under the umbrella of PCI.
Right, so it's not just you by yourself with the problem. PCI often includes individual work, but it also incorporates group work and collaboration, which is really interesting. So our mission today, as I see it, is to uncover how this digital scaffolding impacts learning in these different scenarios, right? Whether you're working alone or in a group, and what types of digital scaffolding are the most effective.
Exactly. The research question that we're going to explore today is, how effective is computer-based scaffolding for cognitive learning in STEM when using these problem-solving approaches? And the meta-analysis that we're looking at today combines data from many different studies and gives us some really interesting insights.
Let's unpack the first clue, the size of the group. What did the research tell us about whether it's better to tackle these complex STEM problems alone with digital support or with a buddy or even in a larger group?
So what's really interesting is that the meta-analysis found that CBS generally leads to significant cognitive learning benefits regardless of group size. So whether students worked alone, in pairs, in groups of 3, or small groups of 4 to 6, they all saw learning improvements when using computer-based scaffolding. So that's a really positive finding right off the bat.
That is good news. So CBS is a thumbs up, generally speaking, but there are some finer points here that I think are worth exploring. Where do things get a bit more nuanced?
Yes, exactly. The strength of the learning improvement, which we call the effect size, actually varied depending on the group size. And here's one of the key takeaways. The highest effect size was observed when students worked in pairs. The study found an effect size of 0.59 for pairs.
Okay, so that's a standout number. How did that compare to working alone or working in a slightly larger group?
When students worked individually, the effect size was still positive at 0.47, but it dipped to 0.41 for groups of 3, and then further down to 0.34 for small groups of 4 to 6. And what's important here is that the researchers found a statistically significant difference between the learning gains in pairs and the gains in those slightly larger small groups.
So while CBS is helpful across the board, it seems like there's something special, something more powerful about having just one partner when you're using these digital supports. And is there any learning theory that might give us a clue as to why that is? Why would a duo be more effective for understanding this complex material?
There are actually a few theories that can shed light on this finding. One is Piaget's idea of cognitive conflict. When two people have slightly different understandings of a concept and they interact and communicate, it can create a mental spark that pushes both individuals to reconsider and refine their own thinking. Then you have Vygotsky's concept of the zone of proximal development, which is that sweet spot between what a learner can do independently and what they can achieve with a little bit of guidance. And working with a partner, especially one who might grasp something that you're struggling with, can really pull you into that zone of proximal development. And his idea, intersubjectivity, is also key here. It emphasizes the importance of actively constructing a shared understanding through dialogue and collaboration.
Okay, yeah. So two brains are better than one, bouncing ideas off each other and filling in each other's knowledge gaps. But what happens when you go from a pair to a slightly larger group? Why does the learning effect seem to diminish? Because intuitively, you would think that more minds on a problem would potentially bring more diverse perspectives and maybe more solutions, even with the coordination challenges.
That's a great question. And while it seems intuitive that more perspectives would be beneficial, the reality is that group dynamics can introduce some challenges. And the source highlights this, pointing out that effective teamwork really relies on a few key things: active participation from all members, clear and concise communication, and the ability for everyone to contribute their unique knowledge and perspectives. As you add more people to a group, it can become increasingly difficult to ensure that everyone has an equal opportunity to participate and that all those different viewpoints are effectively integrated. And the researchers also mentioned previous findings from other studies that have shown that smaller groups tend to have more positive outcomes in terms of creativity and interaction. Although it's worth noting that those earlier studies weren't specifically focused on computer-based scaffolding, so more research is definitely needed in this area. But it does seem like there's a sweet spot with pairs where you have enough interaction to stimulate learning, but not so many voices that the discussion gets bogged down in coordination.
Interesting. So maybe the takeaway here is that when tackling these tough STEM problems with digital support, think buddy system, not a whole study group, right? All right, so we've talked about the ideal group size. Now let's dig into whether that sweet spot changes based on the type of digital support we're talking about. The research mentions different types of scaffolding, right?
Yes. The meta-analysis categorized computer-based scaffolding into four main types: conceptual, metacognitive, strategic, and motivational. So let's start with conceptual scaffolding. This type of scaffolding helps you understand the core concepts of what you're learning. It's about grasping the what to think about. One example they give is watching an expert video where the expert walks through their problem-solving process out loud, giving you a glimpse into their thinking.
Okay, so that's like having a mental walkthrough from someone who really knows what they're doing. What about the other types of scaffolding?
So the next type is strategic scaffolding. This type focuses on the how of problem solving, providing you with an overall game plan or step-by-step approach to tackling the problem. A good example of this is the algebra system, which is a digital tool that helps students learn how to set up and solve algebra word problems. Then we have metacognitive scaffolding. This type encourages you to think about your own thinking. It helps you plan, monitor your progress, and reflect on your learning process. A common example of this would be a planning sheet that you might use for a large research project. And finally, there's motivational scaffolding. This type aims to keep you engaged and motivated by tapping into things like your confidence and interest in the subject matter. A game-like environment, for example, that visually represents your progress could be considered a form of motivational scaffolding.
So these are all very distinct ways that technology can support learning. Did the researchers find that the effectiveness of these different types of scaffolding varied depending on whether the students were working individually or in groups?
That's a great question, and that's exactly what they wanted to find out. So for individual work, they found that conceptual scaffolding had a slightly higher effect size, 0.48, compared to strategic 0.47 and metacognitive scaffolding, 0.38. But those differences weren't statistically significant. And interestingly, they didn't find any studies that used motivational scaffolding in group work, and for individual work, they found that motivational scaffolding's effect was not significantly different from zero.
Okay, so if you're learning alone with CBS, it seems like the specific type of scaffolding, whether it's helping you understand the concepts, the strategies, or your own thought process, doesn't make a huge difference in the overall learning outcome, at least based on this data.
Right. That's a fair summary of the findings for individual work. Now, for group work, the picture shifts a little bit. Here, metacognitive scaffolding had a nominally higher effect size at 0.48, followed by conceptual scaffolding at 0.46, and then strategic scaffolding at 0.39. But again, similar to individual work, the differences between these scaffolding types weren't statistically significant for group learning either.
So whether you're learning alone or in a group with CBS, the specific type of scaffolding doesn't seem to make a statistically significant difference in terms of learning outcomes. It does seem to have a generally positive impact, though. Now, you mentioned an earlier study that had different results when it came to group learning with technology. Can you remind me about that study?
Yes, so the researchers in this meta-analysis actually compared their findings to a previous meta-analysis by Liu and colleagues from 2001. And that earlier study had actually found larger learning gains for group learning compared to individual learning when using a variety of different computer technologies, such as tutorials, practice exercises, and simulations. But it's important to note that this current meta-analysis that we're discussing today specifically focused on scaffolding, which tends to emphasize those learning strategies that we talked about earlier, and they found a different pattern of results.
Okay, so that's an interesting puzzle. Why do you think these two meta-analyses might have arrived at different conclusions?
While the authors of the current study offered a couple of possible explanations. One is that this current meta-analysis had a more narrow focus on learning strategies in their definition of scaffolding. Many of the technologies that were included in that earlier study, like simple drill and practice software, might not have explicitly targeted those deeper learning strategies. Another really important factor could be the inherent feedback mechanisms in collaborative learning. When you're working with others, you naturally explain your thinking, you get feedback from your peers, and that back and forth dialogue can really enhance understanding. And while good scaffolding should also incorporate feedback, the social dynamics and real-time interaction of peer learning might offer a unique dimension that wasn't as prominent in the broader range of technologies that were examined in that earlier study.
Right. It makes sense that it's not just about having technology, but how that technology is actually supporting the learning process. Whether it encourages that active engagement and feedback, whether it's coming from the computer itself or from your peers. Now, the next piece of this puzzle we need to talk about is something called collaboration guidance. So, what exactly is collaboration guidance, and how does it relate to computer-based scaffolding?
So collaboration guidance, as defined in the source, is any type of support that is specifically designed to help students work together more effectively. It could include things like prompts that encourage discussion and debate, structures for how to organize their group work, or even tools that allow them to monitor each other's contributions. You can think of it as providing students with a recipe for successful teamwork. So some examples could be things like pre-designed scripts for discussions, tools that visually represent the group's activities, or even collaborative digital workspaces that guide their joint decision-making.
So it's not just about providing scaffolding for each individual learner within the group. Collaboration guidance is about actively shaping and supporting the process of working together as a group. Now, what did the research find when they compared groups that only had CBS versus groups that had both CBS and this collaboration guidance? And I have a feeling this might be where we get to some surprising results.
You are absolutely right. This is where the findings get really interesting and even a little bit counterintuitive. The meta-analysis showed that groups that were only supported by scaffolding actually had a significantly higher learning gain than groups that received both scaffolding and collaboration guidance. The effect size for the scaffolding-only group was 0.63, which is quite substantial, whereas the effect size for the group with both scaffolding and collaboration guidance was only 0.29. So the key message here is that more support isn't always better. Sometimes it's like having too many GPS systems all giving you different directions at the same time.
Wow, that's a huge difference. It really flips what you might initially assume. You'd think that giving students more support, both for their individual learning through scaffolding and for their group interactions through collaboration guidance, would lead to even better learning outcomes. But why might the opposite be true? I'm sure the source offers some potential explanations for this unexpected finding.
Yes, and they go into quite a bit of detail about this. One of the key concepts they discuss is guidance dissonance. And the idea here is that there might be conflicting goals or approaches embedded within the scaffolding, which often focuses on individual task completion and knowledge acquisition, versus the collaboration guidance, which focuses more on the social and interactive aspects of group work. And they emphasize the importance of what they call guidance alignment, which is based on the script theory of guidance. And this theory suggests that for collaboration guidance to be effective, it needs to be closely aligned with the way students are already learning through the problem-centered instruction itself.
So is it possible that having both types of guidance might actually be pulling students in different directions or making it unclear which set of instructions to prioritize?
Exactly. That's one possibility. Another potential explanation that they explore has to do with what they call overlapping opportunities and constraints. So scaffolding, collaboration guidance, and the inherent nature of problem-centered instruction all present learners with opportunities to learn and grow, but they also come with certain boundaries and limitations. And for groups to effectively leverage those opportunities, they need to be able to coordinate their actions and make decisions collectively. But sometimes the constraints imposed by one form of guidance might inadvertently negate the benefits of another. And this makes it really tricky to provide students with meaningful choices about how they want to approach their learning and collaboration when there are so many different sets of guidelines in play.
It does sound like a lot to juggle. It's like that saying, too many cooks in the kitchen, where all the different forms of guidance end up getting in the way rather than actually helping. What other possibilities did the researchers consider?
Another interesting point they brought up is the idea of learner appropriation of guidance. And what they're suggesting here is that students in groups that are receiving explicit collaboration guidance might actually just be going through the motions of peer interaction without really deeply engaging with the ideas that are being shared. On the other hand, scaffolding, when done well, often pushes students towards that deeper, more critical level of cognitive processing. So if the collaboration guidance inadvertently leads to more superficial engagement with peer work, that could potentially explain why those groups showed lower learning gains compared to groups that were primarily relying on scaffolding for support.
That is a really insightful point. It highlights that it's not just about whether collaboration is happening, but the quality of that collaboration, whether it's leading to a genuine cognitive engagement with the material.
Exactly. And then finally, they discuss the issue of differential appropriation within groups. And this refers to the fact that in any group, different members might interpret and apply the collaboration guidance in different ways. And when you combine that with the individual scaffolding that each student is receiving and the inherent rules and structure of the problem-centered instruction activity itself, you could end up with this really complex mix of different approaches and expectations. And this could potentially overwhelm learners and distract them from the core learning goals.
So it sounds like finding that right balance between scaffolding and collaboration guidance is a lot more nuanced than just simply providing both and hoping for the best. There's a real risk of those different support mechanisms clashing or being misinterpreted by the learners. Now, did the source suggest any potential solutions or ways forward for addressing these challenges?
Yes, they did. They proposed the idea of allowing for what they call greater learner instrumentalization of collaboration guidance. And what they mean by this is that instead of presenting collaboration guidance as a set of rigid rules that must be followed, it could be presented more as a set of general suggestions or guidelines that learners can adapt and interpret based on their own unique needs and the specific demands of the problem they're working on. This approach would give students more autonomy over their collaboration process, which is generally considered a good thing in problem-centered instruction, as it encourages them to take ownership of their learning.
That makes a lot of sense. Giving learners more flexibility and control over how they collaborate within a broader supportive framework. Now, the source also mentions a specific theoretical framework that they use to help understand these complex interactions within PCI. Can you tell us a little bit about activity theory and the role it plays in making sense of all this?
Yes, so the researchers use cultural historical activity theory as a lens for understanding all the different elements that are at play within these problem-centered instruction environments. Activity theory views human behavior as always situated within a broader system of activity. And this system is composed of 6 interconnected elements. You have the subject, which refers to the learner or learners involved. You have the tools, which are the resources and artifacts that are used to mediate the activity. In this case, that would include the computer-based scaffolding. Then you have the object, which is the goal or objective of the activity. So in PCI, that would be solving the problem or mastering a particular concept. Then you have the rules, which are the norms and guidelines that govern the activity. Then there's the community, which is the social group or groups that are involved. And finally, you have the division of labor, which refers to how tasks are distributed and coordinated among members of the community. So activity theory provides a framework for analyzing how all these different elements interact and influence each other within a particular activity system.
Okay, I can see how those pieces fit together. The learner, the tools, the goal, the rules, the group. How does this framework specifically help us understand the role of group size and scaffolding in learning?
So when you're learning individually, the activity system is relatively simple. You have you as the subject, the scaffolding as your tool, and the learning goal as the object. But when you introduce collaboration, the system becomes much more complex. You now have the added layers of rules for collaboration, the community of learners, and the division of labor. And scaffolding in this context acts as a mediating tool that helps bridge the gap between the learners and their learning goals. Collaboration and group size directly relate to the community and the division of labor, shaping how learners interact, communicate, and share responsibilities within the group. So activity theory helps us see that learning is not just about individual learners and isolated tools. It's about understanding the entire system of activity and how all those different elements can work together to either support or hinder learning.
It's like having a bigger picture view of how learning actually happens in these complex social environments. And it helps explain why simply throwing more support at a problem, like adding collaboration guidance on top of scaffolding, doesn't always lead to the desired outcomes. It's about how all those supports are integrated and how they interact within the broader system.
Exactly. It's about finding that right balance and ensuring that all the elements of the activity system are working together harmoniously.
This has been incredibly insightful. As we wrap up, can you tell us a little bit about the limitations of this meta-analysis? What did the researchers themselves point out as areas for future research?
Of course. The researchers did acknowledge a few limitations. One was that they might have missed some relevant studies, especially those that focused on collaborative learning but didn't specifically use the term scaffolding in their descriptions. So they suggested that future meta-analyses in this area should really carefully consider the keywords they use in their searches and potentially even expand their search to include a wider range of databases beyond just the ones that they included in this particular study.
Yeah, it makes sense to cast a wider net to ensure that you're capturing all the relevant research out there. What other limitations did they highlight?
Another challenge they encountered was that the descriptions of collaboration guidance in the different studies they analyzed were often not very detailed or consistent, which made it difficult for them to accurately categorize and compare the different approaches to supporting collaboration. So they really emphasized the need for future research in this area to provide much clearer and more comprehensive descriptions of the collaboration supports that they're using. This will allow for more robust comparisons and a better understanding of which approaches are most effective in which contexts.
So, the level of detail and clarity in the original research really has a big impact on our ability to draw broader conclusions and make generalizations later on.
Exactly. And finally, they also pointed out that most of the studies included in their meta-analysis were conducted in STEM fields. So they suggested that future research should explore how computer-based scaffolding and collaboration guidance might work differently in other subject areas, such as history, English, or the arts. They also encouraged researchers to explore the effects of CBS in more diverse educational settings, with learners of varying abilities, and to look at a wider range of learning outcomes, beyond just cognitive gains, such as motivation, metacognition, and different types of cognitive skills. And they particularly emphasized the need for more research on how to effectively implement scaffolding in group settings, and how to best integrate scaffolding with collaboration guidance to maximize learning.
So, it sounds like while this meta analysis provides some really valuable insights into the current state of the field, there are still a lot of unanswered questions and exciting avenues for future research.
Definitely. It's a rapidly evolving field with tremendous potential, and this meta-analysis gives us a solid foundation to build upon.
So, for our listeners out there, the key takeaway here is that computer based scaffolding is definitely a powerful tool for enhancing learning, especially in STEM fields where problem solving is so central. But it's not just about throwing technology at the problem, it's about being strategic and thoughtful about how you're implementing it. Things like group size and the specific type of scaffolding you're using can make a big difference. And that surprising finding about pairs often showing the most significant learning gains and the potential pitfalls of combining scaffolding with explicit collaboration guidance are really important considerations for educators and designers of learning technologies.
Absolutely. Context matters, and the specific type of support you provide should be carefully tailored to the learners and the learning goals.
It really gives you a lot to think about, right? How can we create learning environments that effectively leverage the power of both individual digital support and collaborative learning without creating that guidance dissonance that we talked about? It makes you reflect on your own learning experiences. When have you felt most supported in a group setting? And when has too much instruction or too much guidance felt like it was actually hindering your learning? This deep dive has given us a lot to ponder, and we encourage you to explore the research cited in the show notes if you're interested in learning more about this fascinating topic. Thanks for joining us today.